In this presentation, we'll talk about ethical relativism and then briefly discuss Vaughn's comments about ethics and religion. As you can probably guess, this presentation is broken into two different parts. So we'll first look at the ethical relativism aspect of this, which includes subjective relativism and cultural relativism. And then we'll briefly just look at the Euthyphro dilemma and have a conversation about ethics and religion. So let's begin by looking at ethical relativism. Vaughn defines ethical relativism as right and wrong being defined relative to a specific belief system. We can separate ethical relativism into two different types of camps here. So if right and wrong is up to the discretion of an individual, this would be subjective relativism. It's your opinion type approach to ethics where I decide what's right and wrong, you decide what's right and wrong for yourself, and we just agree that we all decide what's right and wrong on our own terms. Then we also have cultural relativism, which is just a step higher to say that cultures are what dictate what right and wrong actions are instead of the individual. So because individuals participate within cultures, and then whatever culture defines right and wrong as, then all the individuals agree to that definition of right and wrong. As Vaughn tries to do in his chapter, I'm going to try to do the same, and that is convince you that this is a terrible philosophy. It's very easy. That's why it appeals to a lot of people. It does it and sort of subverts your critical thinking. It just, hey, I don't have to contemplate these complicated issues. Instead, I'm just going to say it's up to whatever I decide, or it's up to any culture to decide what's right and wrong for themselves. Who am I to interject in that respect? If you were pushed on ethical relativism, I am convinced that you would give it up quite quickly. So here's the example. Do you think murdering is wrong? I suspect that your answer to that question is, yes, I think murdering is wrong. Do you think murdering is wrong in any place at any time? If your response is, well, if some culture thinks that murdering me is the right thing, then who am I to tell them that that's an incorrect belief to hold? You can think of way more heinous acts that different cultures might subscribe to, or different individuals condone. And once you start trying to parse them out, you realize that you do believe that there are some moral norms that are consistent through longer threads of communities or individuals, and that just because one culture decides that it's okay doesn't mean that it's okay. As Vaughn talks about in this chapter here, he says that it implies that we cannot legitimately criticize other cultures for their beliefs, but we make these evaluative judgments on different cultures all the time. Similarly, Vaughn talks about how it's almost impossible to determine which culture your moral norms are coming from. I told you in the introduction to this course that I'm from Ohio, and I'm a Bengals fan. So technically, I subscribe to the culture of Bengals fandom. I also subscribe to the culture of philosophy. I also subscribe to the culture of Wichita State. You can start to see how our cultures have a lot of different overlapping concentric circles, and sometimes those moral norms are going to be in conflict with one another. So how do you decide what's right and wrong based on your culture if it's not so simply understood what culture you belong to and which norms you are sort of expected to uphold? So like I said, I really want to challenge you this semester to push aside, or at least quell, any thoughts that you might have towards ethical relativism being a way to operate in this world, and really challenge yourself to get into the moral arguments and think about how different policies or different acts or different practices or different character traits are ones that should be countenanced or sort of decide or dictate what right and wrong action are, or good and bad character traits are. So the other side to ethical relativism is moral objectivism, which is that there are at least some moral standards that are objective. I gave you the example of murder just a second ago. If you think that murder is wrong no matter where it is and when it happens in whatever culture, then that would be a moral norm that is objective. It's one that you cannot say that it's culturally dependent or relative to an individual's own personal moral tastes, as you would. So I'm hoping, again, to convince you that there are some moral objective facts, truths, and it's our job to try to uncover them. Whether or not we're completely successful at that time will tell. But there is the pragmatist in me that thinks that it's always our obligation to keep trying to strive towards improving our understanding of the way in which right and wrong action are to be defined going forward. The other side to moral objectivism, which we talked about in the previous presentation, was the absolute duties, absolute principles, and hopefully you remember that on one side you got absolute principles, absolute duties. On the other side you have prima facie principles, prima facie duties. So an absolute principle is one that you have to uphold no matter what. There are no exceptions. Prima facie principles are the ones in which you're obligated to uphold, but there is wiggle room for exceptions as long as there are good moral reasons to justify that exception. So moral absolutism just refers to objective moral principles allow no exceptions or must be applied the same way in all cases and cultures. So if we think something like murder is to be considered a wrong no matter what, that would be a case of absolute, that would be an absolute duty or an absolute principle, and that would be part of the moral absolutism aspect of this. So just to recap here real quick, ethical relativism, that's the idea that, right and wrong are determined relative to some belief system. I'm hoping that you will resist the urge to just refer to ethical relativism as a justification for different practices. And then we have moral objectivism on the other side, which is just to say that, well, not everything is relative. I want to briefly discuss this section that Vaughan has on ethics and religion. I think it's important to at least have this brief conversation because we're going to be talking about a number of controversial topics throughout the semester, like abortion and euthanasia. So I think it's worth having. I like where Vaughan starts because he starts where most philosophers do when having this discussion, which is the Euthyphro dilemma. So the Euthyphro dilemma comes from one of the Platonic dialogues titled Euthyphro, in which we see Socrates having a conversation with Euthyphro about what it means to be religious or what piety is, because Euthyphro claims to know what it is, and Socrates is doing his Socrates thing where he's like, well, then let me ask you some questions so I can understand your definition for it. Eventually in the dialogue, you get to this point where Socrates asks, is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? So if it's the first option, that something is good because God wills it, it seems like what's good and bad are just arbitrary decisions that are up to God's opinions. So just as I might like broccoli and you do not like broccoli, or any other type of example like that, the idea is that if it seems like good and bad are just the opinions of God, then they're just arbitrary, and we don't usually associate arbitrariness with a perfect being that we think or that we imagine God being. And so it seems to run against these common beliefs about the qualities that God has and tries to conflate them with ones that humans would have, an imperfect being versus a perfect being. And so the whole idea here is that this first option doesn't seem consistent with those beliefs that a perfect being would not have this arbitrariness to them. The second option is that something is good, that God wills that something because it is good, meaning that in this case, the measure of goodness exists independent of God. God is just trying to exercise this independent measure that dictates what is good and bad or right and wrong. And in this case, then, it's not clear that God is making what's good and bad. It's just the fact that there is good and bad, and God is trying to exercise it. So with divine command theory, if you've ever heard of it, we'll talk about natural law theory in the next week's lecture, but we won't really talk about divine command theory too much. Divine command theory is just basically the idea that something is right and wrong because God wills it. It's still consistent with this framework here because the idea is that good and bad are some objective standards that exist, and God willing them is because they're good or bad. Why I bring this up is because, again, we're going to be talking about a number of controversial topics in this course. I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable talking about these topics and don't feel concerned about holding certain religious beliefs or not holding any religious beliefs, so on and so forth. The idea here is that religion can be a strong motivation for giving a particular moral argument, but it seems like when we're having this conversation, you can't just say, I think something's right and wrong because of religion X. It seems like there needs to be some sort of basis for that argument. And again, throughout the history of philosophy, there have been religious philosophers for the most part, or for the bulk of philosophy as a discipline. It's been dominated by religious minds. So I don't want you to feel uncomfortable about having these conversations about employing these critical reasoning, critical thinking skills, because religion can still be a strong motivation for different moral arguments. But the idea is that we exchange these moral arguments and we try to find justifications for certain actions and unearth these moral norms by giving each other reasons to accept or reject certain arguments. And so this section I think Vaughan has included because it's can run the same way as ethical relativism, where somebody might say or give an argument that you believe X is good or X is right because you believe X religion, and that doesn't seem to hold up against our scrutiny that we would expect from a moral argument to be able to accept that some things are right and some things are wrong. So hopefully that's clear. Like I said, moving forward, I just want you to feel comfortable in this class, regardless of whatever your religious background is. And so this is an important discussion, I think, to have. Now let's recap. So we talked about ethical relativism, which is the idea that right and wrong are defined relative to a specific belief system. We have both subjective relativism, which is the idea that the individual decides what's right and wrong. I have my own thoughts about right and wrong. You have your own thoughts about right and wrong. So-and-so has their own thoughts about right and wrong, and none of us can be challenged on those thoughts because we all determine what's right and wrong for ourselves. That's ethical relativism, and I'm hoping you can be convinced to give that up if that's your modus operandi for approaching ethics as a study. Again, I don't think that you would be committed to it if you were pushed on it. So that's ethical relativism. Then we also talked about moral objectivism, which suggests that there are at least some moral truths that exist. And we talked about moral absolutism in connection with moral objectivism, which is the idea that some moral norms are expected to be upheld everywhere at all times. Some moral truths always hold. And so I gave you the example of murder. Murder is always bad, regardless of what culture you're in, whether you are the one being murdered or somebody else is being murdered. Sorry for keep on using that as an example, but you can think of a ton of heinous acts that seem to be wrong regardless of the circumstances that somebody finds themselves in. That would be moral objectivism. And then we finished by just talking briefly about the role of religion here in ethics. As I was just saying, it can be a strong motivation for why you are giving one moral argument over another. But it's important to always supplement those motivations with moral reasons and arguments if they're actually going to justify particular actions.